Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give it a few minutes while everybody joins. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Welcome, everyone. We've still got some people joining here, so we'll hold on for just a minute. You should be able to hear me and see my screen right now. Okay. Great, let's get started. So welcome, everyone. This is the second webinar in a series for PTE. And the first webinar, if you didn't see it, is a really valuable one. Julian Burnley was talking about the foundations of PTE. It was a really nice introduction to an overview of the PT academic and core tests. So you won't need that information today, but it's a helpful background if you haven't seen it yet. Today, we're going to be talking about the role of automated AI in human scoring in PTE. And the aim is to explain how the different scoring systems or the different types of scoring work within PTE and how they all come together to ensure that we have sort of consistency, reliability, and fairness in assessments. And we'll talk about getting that balance right between human judgment and automated scoring systems and how ultimately using a combination of these things is really of a benefit to test takers and learners and teachers. And then I'll go over some of the research from the last few years that we've done to help continuously improve our scoring systems. In particular, we'll talk about authentic communication compared to memorized scripts and things like that. So before we get started, just introduce myself. I'm Sarah Hughes. I'm the head of test design and validation for PTE, and I work in the assessment research and validity team. So my team is really interested in making sure that the assessments are valid and trustworthy, and we're engaged in research and looking into evidence into how the assessments function and making sure that they're very high quality. So I've worked in lots of different kinds of assessment over the years, UK qualifications, vocational and academic, things like GCSEs and A levels. I've worked on high stakes US assessments for college and postgraduate entry, and I've been in language testing for quite a few years now. I will say for this webinar, I started out in test prep as a test prep instructor. I used to do test preparation for the GRE and the GMAT, if anyone's heard of those. So I have a great respect for all of you and for anybody working with test takers to get them ready to take some really important tests that have huge consequence for their lives. So it's great to have everybody here today. My research focus is also something sort of the focus of this session. So I focus my research on scoring and measurement, and in particular, the role that AI plays in scoring and assessment. I think there's a lot of very flashy and exciting research these days on all the many things that we can do with AI. But my research is much more focused on what should we be doing with AI in the context of assessment? What's the best and most responsible way to use this technology as part of an assessment? So we'll jump right in and look at that first objective. How do we ensure fairness, consistency, reliability in PTE and all the different forms of scoring involved? So this, I think most people would be maybe not surprised to know, but we have three different types of scoring or scorers in PTE tests, human, automatic, and automated/AI. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about automated scoring in AI because it's the most exciting, it's the newest, and it's something that PTE really pioneered. But there are other forms of scoring that take place at different parts in the development and operation of the assessments. So we do use human scoring at certain points. And I'll just give a quick overview of what each of these things means, because I think sometimes we take that for granted that everyone knows what different types of scoring are. So human scoring, most people are familiar with. You have expert human raters who judge responses according to scoring criteria and rules to determine, the best score for a response. And all of our scoring criteria and rules can be found in the test taker score guide that you see on screen. So that's available on our website. And if you haven't read through it, highly recommend. It explains in detail how each item type is scored. I won't be going over that today, and I think Julian touched on it a bit in the first webinar session. So each item type has slightly different scoring. So all of those rules that humans designed and used are in the score guide for test takers there. Some questions on the test are scored automatically. And typically when we say automatic scoring, we're talking about computer scoring, machine scoring for things that are rule-based, right? So things that have objectively correct answers. And we use rule-based scoring systems to determine if the answer is one of the correct ones selected. So this could be something like a multiple choice question, just checking that the correct option has been ticked. But there are also some other kind of constrained or closed response questions in the tests that use automatic scoring, things like reordering paragraphs around. So some of these are scored either correct or incorrect. Some of them receive partial credit depending on how many correct answers that you got, but they really are based on sort of an objectively correct answer. Automated scoring is more open-ended, and we use complex models to do this. So it's based in machine learning and AI capabilities, and we build these scoring models to predict the way a human rater would score a response. So this is used for things that are open-ended, like, for example, an essay. Where humans have scored something on rating criteria, we've trained an automated system to use different measurements to predict the human ratings. So automatic and automated sometimes get confused, and actually sometimes they're used together, which is perhaps even more confusing. But for example, just to make it a bit clearer, something like a read aloud question has an automatic element to it because there's an objectively correct sentence that a test taker needs to read, and we can see exactly how much of that sentence the test taker has read aloud. But we're also assessing things like fluency and pronunciation, which is using automated or AI scoring at the same time. So this is just to say that these categories are categories that we use to describe kinds of scoring, but they're not hard and fast rules. There's some overlap between them, and quite often we use them together in different ways. And I'd also say that I don't think any one of these types of scoring is considered sort of sufficient in itself, right? So I don't think anyone would argue that human only or AI only scoring is the only correct approach to assessment. I think the approach we take with different PTE tests is finding the right combination of different kinds of scoring and measurement to make sure that we're capturing what we need to from each test taker's response. So the way that we get that balance right is we sort of look at the strengths and the limitations of each type of scoring to figure out where it's most suited in different scenarios. So I'll start with human raters because I think this is what most people are familiar with. And they're considered the gold standard in assessment. It's always been human rating that was sort of central to assessment. And that's because there are a lot of strengths involved with human raters. So people like you and I have an understanding of language use and language proficiency as a construct or an idea. So we're immersed in it in our daily lives, and expert raters are trained in all the nuances of this. And that knowledge really extends outside of just the test situation, right? So we have an understanding of the context and meaning of language use. And human raters can also reason and articulate their judgment. So you can ask them why they gave a certain score. You can debate whether that score was the correct score to give. And they can reconsider when provided with new information, which is at the moment within assessment, that's definitely a human strength. And I think they're also trusted. One of the reasons for that is because our raters are people who are very committed to scoring well, and they care about test takers. They want to do right by them. So it's an important thing to be evaluated by somebody who cares about getting it right. So that element is really important human sort of judgment to keep within the loop. But for all of those strengths, there are some definite limitations for human scorers. Most of them have to do with human subjectivity, right? We're all fallible. Humans can be inconsistent. So the list over on the left side of the screen shows the most common types of inconsistency or unreliability. We generally refer to these as rater effects or human rater effects. So this list is includes rater effects that have been long studied in assessment research. So these are very well established tendencies in human raters, and there's been a lot of research to try to address these tendencies and mitigate for them in assessment. So things like leniency or severity. If you happen to have a really severe teacher, you might find that you don't score as well when being assessed by them versus if you were assessed by a different person. Other people are just generally more lenient. They're looking for the good in every response. So every rater has sort of a different level of leniency or severity that you try to even out with training. There's also something called the halo effect, which has to do with the way that human raters are not particularly great at evaluating things in isolation. So if you watched Julian's webinar or you're familiar with the scoring criteria for something like the essay, you know that the essay scored on lots of different traits. So content, form, general linguistic range, development, structure, coherence, vocabulary, grammar, spelling. So there's lots of elements to the scoring. One thing that human raters have a tendency to do is if one particular version of those traits is done very well, that may sort of bleed into their evaluation of other traits. So if you've ever had a conversation with somebody who's very fluent and very engaging, you might evaluate their content to be better than it really is, because you're sort of influenced by how well they spoke, that you maybe don't evaluate the content as objectively. So this is just sort of a natural human tendency that we know exists. Central tendency has to do with the way that humans use score scales. So if you have a score scale from 0 to 6, you'll find that quite a lot of ratings will cluster in the center around 3 or 4. And maybe that's because most people will score sort of in the middle of a scale, or really are just demonstrating sort of a average kind of ability. But part of it is caution on the part of raters. So it's quite risky to give a score at the extreme end of the scale. You have to be really sure of yourself to say this is a 0 or this is a 6. And so people tend to be cautious and sort of group towards the middle of the scale. And human raters can also show fatigue. So other sort of aspects of just having a human body and attention span. You might find that a Friday afternoon at 5 p.m., you're going to start giving up very different ratings than you did Monday morning at 8 a.m. Or if you, after lunch, for example, start feeling a bit sleepy, your attention might wander, and that can affect the way that you rate. So there's some fluctuation with human attention in the task of rating. And we also know there's forms of bias that accompany human rating, and almost always unconscious bias that can creep into an assessment and has to be very strongly guarded against. So one example that has nothing to do with PTE or even language testing was that a few years ago, there was some research done on a handwritten exam where test takers wrote long responses by hand, and was found that people who had handwriting that was very bubbly and very round were scoring lower than people who otherwise had quite angular or harsh handwriting. So I think the idea there was that there's some gender element in handwriting that was motivating an unconscious bias in scoring, which is an interesting idea. There are many examples of this, so that's just sort of one of them. But it's something that needs to be constantly monitored and evaluated to make sure that nobody's being biased along characteristics that we would not want to be part of an evaluation or an assessment. So aside from that, humans also have limited processing and memory capacity, which means I only have the experience that I have as a teacher, as a researcher. I don't know the experience of other people, and I can't really just absorb it easily. So if somebody has a very limited experience with accents or just a few types of speaking, then they might not be very well equipped to judge a range of test takers with a range of accents from a range of different countries. It might not actually be active bias in the assessment. It might be a limited exposure to the range of test taker characteristics, which means that they're just not very good at measuring things they're unfamiliar with. So that's part of it, is there's sort of a limitation of just being inherently human. And then also, if you're running a global assessment with a high volume of test takers all over the world, you probably also have a lot of raters that are working in sort of disconnected pockets. And even with the best sort of communication and structure for managing that group of raters, you'll still find that there's never an instantaneous shift. So things have to cascade through different teams of raters. You have to transmit knowledge through word of mouth or documentation. And it's never perfect or seamless. It's sort of, you're always working with a distributed network of people rather than a central standard that you can easily control. So a lot of these things, there are steps to mitigate them through training, through working, through sort of designing scoring so that you're using multiple raters and mitigating biases. But I think it's important to acknowledge that these limitations will never go away with human scoring. They're always something sort of baked into it, but they have to be actively addressed and planned for and monitored as a part of any high-stakes assessment. Look at automatic scoring, strengths and weaknesses, yes, next, because this is a bit simpler even. So with automatic scoring, things like MCQs, very rule-based, very objective scoring. The strengths there is that this can be completely accurate and reliable, because if the multiple choice question's answer is C, it's always going to be C. It doesn't matter who is saying that it's C. It's a very quick and efficient way of assessing people. It means that we can include a wide range of questions in an assessment and gather a lot of different points of data on test takers very efficiently. It means that we can also report results quickly because those questions are quicker to score. And it also means that the automatic scoring can be used to assess really targeted types of skills or language skills proficiency. Because you can ask a really focused question with an objective answer. You can ask a lot of them, and you can do it in a very quick time period. So it means that you can really target an assessment. The flip side of that is that because you're targeting specific skills, if that were all that you were to do in an assessment, you'd have kind of a narrow view of language. So if you have an assessment that over relies on constrained item types and automatic scoring, then you're only ever seeing sort of a sliver of what a test taker can really do with language. So it's important to have a balance there. I think we wouldn't want to remove automatic scoring or constrained items from assessment because they do provide such reliable and rich information, but they would never be able to provide you with a range of skills assessment that you would from other forms of scoring. And before I move on to look at the strengths and weaknesses for automated scoring, I'm just going to take a minute to talk about how PTE's scoring system, automated scoring system, was developed, just to give some background on that. So PTE's automated scoring system was developed initially during the field test, which is over 15 years ago. There were 10,000 test takers in that field test, from many countries, many languages represented, many different accents represented, and many, many responses collected. So over 400,000 spoken, 50,000 written responses. It's a really rich and representative data set of test takers, and that forms sort of the basis of the scoring system. All of those responses were rated by at least 2 human raters. So if the 2 human raters agreed on the score, then that was the score for the response. If they disagreed, then another human rater came in to adjudicate what the correct score would be. And this is an example of one of the ways you can minimize bias in human rating by having multiple raters involved in the process. So it's not possible for one rater to sort of pull in a very different direction from the others. So this means that we had a very large and representative sample of test taker responses and very high quality ratings on that sample of responses. And those two things then fed into training the scoring models. So when I say training the scoring models, what I mean is automated scoring essentially does 2 things. There's a part that measures all of the characteristics of the response. So if in writing, it's measuring many, many different linguistic features and characteristics of the writing. So there are models that just do the measuring. And then there's a model that uses all of those measurements to predict the score that human raters would give to that response. So when we're training the model, what that means is we're feeding it lots of responses that it can measure, and then we're feeding it lots of human ratings to learn how to predict those human ratings from those measurements. And once you've got that model created, it takes quite a lot of time and investment to do. And it's one thing to mention is that our scoring algorithms are proprietary. Nobody else has them. The amount of data and the quality of data that goes into creating something like that is not something that's publicly available. So I mentioned that just to say that I think sometimes people claim to have recreated or cracked a scoring system. That's not really possible to do. So once you have that model established, the way that you evaluate it is by testing how accurately it can predict scores for a new sample of responses. So we take a large sample of fresh responses, feed it into the scoring model, and see, does it predict human rater scores? And during this whole initial setup in the field test, the automated scoring system agreed with human raters as often as 2 humans agreed with each other, and sometimes more often. So it was a better predictor in some cases. And this was all the foundation that set up the initial scoring system. But I do want to emphasize that it's not that we sort of created this and then it just stayed the same for 15 years. I'm trying to indicate that with this little cycle symbol I've got in the middle of the diagram there to say that it's a constant iteration of developing models and improving on them and training them on new data. So every time a new question is put into the question bank for PTE, that question is trained on, the models are trained for that specific question using new test taker responses gathered from the current population of test takers. They're trained into the model, and then we again validate how accurate the scoring model was. So it's constantly being refreshed and improving over time. So the strengths there, number one, obviously some incredible pattern recognition and processing power to take all of those linguistic measurements and learn how to predict human scores from them. That's a vast amount of data. And it's also more data than any one human can comprehend at one time in their own head. So the scoring systems have ability to learn beyond the scope of like an individual rater's experience. And this has a lot of benefits. And one of the most beneficial elements is that it makes it more reliable and fair. You have no human rater effects. So the model doesn't have anything like fatigue. It doesn't get hungry. It doesn't feel grumpy. It doesn't make any judgments about people based on accents or physical appearance. It is the same standard applied to every single test taker. And it's also better equipped to make those judgments because it can hold more information about the range of all test takers for PTE rather than just the experience of one rater on one day. It also makes it really easy to monitor the performance of scoring. in a central location and then correct it if it's ever needed. So things like bias, much easier to monitor when you have a central scoring system that you're constantly monitoring and evaluating. And if anything ever needs correction, you can correct within that scoring model and know that it's being applied then to everybody at the same time. Everybody is being evaluated by the same standard. So a lot of strengths there. There are some limitations to automated scoring, and some of them are more perceptions than anything. So there is a perception that machines measure only very superficial characteristics of language, like spelling errors or word counts. And that maybe was true of the very, very first automated scoring systems that were developed, well, actually the first one back in the 60s, but even the very early versions in the late 90s, they were using sort of a limited range of characteristics. But modern automated scoring systems use massive sets of features, and they can take really nuanced measurements of writing and use that to sort of build an idea of what human raters value when they're scoring, and then apply that standard. So while it's not the same thing as a human rater thinking, I don't think we're claiming that AI or automated scoring thinks like a human. But what we are saying is that it can actually measure in quite a lot of granular detail some really nuanced aspects of language like semantic relevance and coherence. There's also a perception that AI systems can be tricked or gamed, like you can hack the system and you can break it. And that's something that I'll speak a bit more about later in the session, and some recent research on that area. But by and large, I think this is sort of built into the design of a system. You do stress test and attempt to break a system before you send it live. So the idea that there's an easy cheat code that if you just know it, you can trick the whole system, I think is a very simplified idea of how that system works. There's quite a lot of those perceptions or tricks circulating, but not necessarily founded in evidence. One thing that is true, though, is that the automated scoring system can only learn what it's taught. So it can only learn from the sample that you give it, and that includes the sample of student responses that it's learning from and the human ratings. So you have to be really careful about what you feed to an automated scoring model to make sure that it learns the right things. And that's a very important part of developing automated scoring systems in general. So all of these things have some strengths and limitations, and you sort of looking through those three options, you wouldn't necessarily pick one and say, that's it, we'll do that with assessment scoring forever. What we tend to do instead is think about what's the right balance of these things. How do we use them in the right way to make sure that scoring is consistent, fair, reliable? So we have a balance of human judgment and automated scoring at different points throughout the system. I think sometimes people think because PTE uses automated scoring that it's just a robot in a room evaluating everything, but humans are involved in every stage of the assessment. And it's really important to, I think, realize that AI is fundamentally a human-created endeavor, so humans are never absent from it. But blending the human judgment into the system helps it become more resilient and responsible in use. So humans within PTE are writing the items, designing the scoring criteria, deciding what matters in scoring, what should be evaluated, what are fundamental characteristics of language proficiency that matter. They're involved in training the automated scoring system, so they're writing the essays that the system learns from, and they're scoring the essays that the system learns from. So all of that human data is used to inform the system. And then in the live operation of the test, humans score certain elements, either alongside the automated scoring system, or they may step in and score responses that the automated scoring system flags to say that it can't score them. So sometimes you might have a response that, for one reason or another, it's an outlier. It's just something the system decides it's not able to score accurately or reliably, so it sends it out to a human to score that instead. We refer to that as exceptions or outlier scorings. So they're involved even in the live assessment element. And then in the end, humans are involved in reviews of any test issues. So technical reviews, for example, if you had an issue with a microphone while you were testing, you can ask for a human review of a test to see if there were any issues that affected the outcome of the test. So humans, very central in the scoring. And we'll talk about how we've been integrating human judgment in an AI in recent years in enhancements to the scoring system and through research, particularly around this idea of authentic communication. So a big focus for us in the research team has been the concept of test integrity in the last few years. And part of this is because we're realizing you can build all of the evidence that you want about a test. You can research whatever you want about a test, but it doesn't matter unless that research demonstrates that the test scores are trustworthy and that they deserve public confidence. So people need to have confidence in tests in order to use them for really high stakes decisions. And institutions like governments, universities, professional bodies, what they value, what gives them confidence in test scores is knowing that they reflect authentic communicative ability for test takers. So one of the ways we've started researching that, looking into this kind of evidence, is looking at how test takers prepare to take the test and how that impacts their teaching and learning practices. So I'll talk about how we've developed some scoring system enhancements over the years and how it's all focusing on this idea of ensuring authentic communicative ability is being measured and that our scores are worthy of confidence. So when we start looking at test taker preparation behaviors, we think about this concept of washback. Washback simply just means that the consequences of testing drive test taker preparation behaviors. If you have a really high stakes test, that's going to change the whole course of your life, change the opportunities available to you, change where you might live next, then you're going to prepare very strongly for this test. And you may focus on scoring higher on the test as sort of your main focus. And language learning might be something you put on the back burner. What we actually want to see for PTE test preparation is we want test takers to prepare for the test in a way that supports developing real language ability that will help them once they get where they're going. So we've partnered with various universities to carry out this kind of research. We conduct this research ourselves as well, but have been partnering with universities for years to get a broad view of test preparation practices and their perceptions of scoring in PTE. So we've worked with University College of London, Queen's University in Canada, University of Melbourne in Australia, and recently Southampton University. That's not on this slide, but it is up on our website. So we have lots of different research studies into how do test takers prepare? What's the effect of preparation? How do they perceive the test? How does that change the way they learn a language? And typically we're looking at three kinds of test preparation behaviors. So there's the first kind of test prep behavior, which is about improving really like actual language skills. So ideally, you want preparing for the test to improve your language skills in the real world. And this might be things like reading the newspaper or going to a coffee shop and having a chat with a stranger. These things improve your language skills, and the more you do them, you'll also score better on the test because you've developed a real skill there. They don't always have to be real life examples. You can do language activities that are geared towards test success, but actually improve underlying ability, right? So things like working on fluency and pronunciation will also help you when you go to communicate with a professor or an employer in a new context. Number two is not about learning at all in terms of language skills, but it's about reducing the barriers to demonstrating language skills. So if you're somebody who has a lot of anxiety around testing, you prepare for the test by learning how to reduce your anxiety, maybe taking deep breaths or mindfulness. And that's an important part of test preparation because it lets you really demonstrate what you can do if you get the anxiety out of the way. Nothing to do with really improving your language skills. Your language skills may already be great, but you won't get the score you need unless you can reduce your barrier to showing your language skill. Other examples are things like increasing test familiarity, so you know what to do on the day and you're not sort of fumbling around trying to figure out what's being asked of you. And other things like time management. These tests can be quite long, so things like learning how to pace yourself and how you should be working through the test in good time will help you achieve the score that you need. They don't really have anything to do with the language skills, but they aren't harming language development or growth. The third type are the tricks and the strategies. So these are things that people do to try to get a higher score, nothing to do with learning a language skill or reducing the barriers to demonstrating their skills. These might be rumors that circulate online or sort of tricks and shortcuts that you can learn to try to score higher without actually improving language skills in certain ways. These are the kinds of strategies that we don't want to see, and we've done some research to try to identify where test takers are using each type of test preparation. And you'll see from the research that's published on the previous slide that a great deal of the test preparation that PTE test takers do falls under categories 1 and 2 test preparation. In terms of research, we've been interested in type 3 preparation to see what test takers are doing that falls under the tricks and strategies category and whether there's anything we need to do to sort of disincentivize that. So one trick or strategy that you all probably be familiar with is using a memorized template for open response questions. So this example here we're going to look at has to do with using a completely memorized essay. So the two sentence frames that you see on screen, they're both 8 words long, and they both might be the way that you start an essay. And I don't have a polling function in this webinar, but I want you all to think for yourselves, if you saw an essay that started with either of these phrases, would you be interested? Would you think anything about that? Would you feel sort of suspicious or alarmed? And if you saw 50,000 essays that started with the first one, in this essay, I will argue, versus how would you feel if you saw 50,000 essays that started in this burgeoning epoch of science and technology, right? So I think I would not personally be alarmed if I saw many essays that say, in this essay, I will argue, and because that's sort of a generic, content-free sort of intro and introduction, an avenue into then providing your own ideas. Whereas in this burgeoning epoch of science and technology, it's very unlikely that 50,000 people just spontaneously thought of this phrase together. It's very unlikely that if this phrase is in the response, that it's also the only phrase in a response that has come from somewhere else. So that's the case. This is the template in this burgeoning epoch of science and technology topic. So this kind of template we call a keyword template, where the whole essay exists with these placeholder words, and test takers are told that they can replace the topic with a keyword from the prompt. I will say I have actually seen people just use this template, keeping the word topic in it rather than replacing it with a topic from the prompt. So in that case, it's just plagiarism and not even a keyword template. But this is a popular template, and it's not even a popular template for PTE. I found this template on websites for IELTS. I've seen this template from tests that have nothing to do with language, language assessments, but they are they are assessments that contain like an argumentative essay as one of the questions. So pretty much anywhere that there is an essay question, there is some form of advice online with this topic. There are many similar kinds of templates like this. So it's not necessarily a problem of PTE or even a problem of language testing. It's a problem of this kind of question type where people are providing memorized, pre-scripted responses that are inauthentic. They aren't their own thinking. So it's important to say that PTE scoring systems have always detected outliers and responses that have insufficient content. So this report from 2013 talks about the scoring engine for automated for PTE and detecting some of these behaviors, whether it could, and this was back in 2013. So responses that are off topic, highly unusual, not represented in training data, or completely irrelevant, those have always been flagged by the system. And when we have responses that don't contain any relevant content, so it's answering a question that hasn't been asked or it's completely off topic, those are always falling under gatekeeper rules. That's always been the case. That's always been the scoring criteria. So if a response doesn't have sufficient content, authentic content in it, then it doesn't receive a score for any of the other traits. The response leaves a score of 0. So that's always been the case. But what we found over recent years was that there's more discussion of keyword templates online, and we're seeing more people attempting to use them over time. We're also seeing those templates evolve more quickly. And so we started thinking about what are ways we can enhance the automated scoring system to sort of keep pace with that evolution and make sure that it's reflecting the current practice of test takers today. So a few years ago, we started developing a system to make sure that we were differentiating between responses that were using keyword templates and responses that were using appropriate essay writing techniques. So this slide on screen now comes from a webinar by Jared Merlot on how to teach, describe, image, and retell lecture questions. And it's also relevant to essays, this particular slide, and talks about things to avoid, which are keyword templates and off-topic responses, and things to do, which are to include material from the prompt, so referencing the image or the lecture that is in the prompt itself, but also how to use lexical chunks and discourse markers flexibly to sort of give structure to the essay. So it's okay to use common phrases like in conclusion, right? But as long as that's being used to scaffold authentic content and to show an original response to the question. If we're using only memorized chunks of language that have come from templates online, then it's not an original response. So if you're interested in sort of understanding that and picking that out a bit more, I highly recommend taking a look at this webinar, and it's linked in that box below. So this is something we started thinking about back before 2020. We worked with universities to conduct some research, some of the research I showed on the previous slide, about how test takers were preparing and what their thoughts were on different item types, how they thought they should approach them. We carried out our own internal research as well to see what strategies people were using in questions when they were producing their own responses. And we started carrying out workshops with human raters to sort of say, all right, we've collected all this information about what test takers are doing to prepare and what kinds of responses we're seeing in the test. And we really want to dive deep into what makes a response acceptable and what makes a response fall into this category of keyword template. Where's the line between those things? And let's make sure that that's really transparent for everyone to see. It's important for us to know in terms of the test itself, but it's very important for us to be able to communicate this outwardly to test takers. And that research in 2020 gave us a framework for how we think about that line between responses that are structured well and are able to use discourse markers and lexical chunks, and responses that are just keyword templates. It also gave us a really large data set to train and evaluate the detection system that we were developing. So really targeted and detailed data on that specific element of where that line is. And in 2021, we started developing and testing these systems for writing and speaking item types. So we were looking at the essay for writing and describe image and retell lecture for speaking. And in 2022, so this is a few years ago now, we launched some enhancements to automated scoring for writing. So that was in 2022. And then the beginning of 2023, we launched the enhancements for speaking. So writing and speaking are different scoring systems, but we wanted to ensure that they were developed in parallel, so they were operating under the same sort of logic and principles. And in 2024, we introduced phase 2, which was an additional layer of human review into that process. So I'll walk through what phase 1 and 2 looked like just a little bit. So we know that phase 1, we wanted to just start detecting more the newer and evolving techniques test takers were using to answer questions, particularly around these templated keyword responses. So we started building a template repository or a database that included all of the templates that we know exist. We did this in 2 ways. So one was we looked on the internet with web crawlers and social media to just identify templates that were in circulation. But we also did some sort of ground up research. We compared a huge number of responses to each other to identify where similar text was occurring. And from that, we could piece together the templates that were in circulation and then find those templates on the internet as well. So then we took this database of templates and worked with human raters to validate that, yes, each one of those is considered to be a keyword template, and it's not, for example, composed of the kinds of lexical chunks or discourse markers that you would expect to see in an essay. The templates in the repository truly are keyword templates. Then we built the detection algorithms to be able to predict those human judgments of what was crossing the line, and we had human validation activities after that. So one thing it's important to know about this is the scoring system is really nuanced and it looks at responses holistically. So it's not just counting words to say, aha, you have 3 template flag words in your response, so 0 score. It's looking at this in a holistic way. So it is considering the amount of known templated phrases in a response. It's also looking at the proportion of the response that's considered authentic text. It's also looking at the density of templated phrases. So if it's that you happen to have a sentence in the beginning that is a bit templated, but then the rest of your essay is completely original content, that's a different case than somebody who has many templated phrases stacked right next to each other, very dense template use. So we want to know how much original content there is and how it's being used to structure and fill out a response. We also look at the quality of the response in terms of coherence and relevance to the question, as at the very basic level, the response needs to be relevant to the question that's been asked. So all of those things go together, all those measurements go together into predicting human ratings of whether or not something had sort of crossed the line into being a keyword template, where it had crossed the line into having not enough authentic content to truly evaluate someone's proficiency. And then the easy part was we already have rules for this. We know that when responses don't demonstrate enough authentic content, they are scored 0, and that's still the case. So the same scoring rule was applied in this case. What the automated scoring system was doing here was just getting better at detecting when it needed to be applied. And we did some human validation activities to make sure that particularly when you're using automated scoring systems to make judgments, we want to make sure that those are fair and that we're using that technology responsibly. So human validation is a really important part of that. And in particular, we want to know that if the system is flagging something, that humans would agree with that. So we don't want cases where the machine is flagging something and humans disagree that it should be flagged. So you can see with speaking in this table, there were no cases of where the machine flagged something, but humans didn't flag it. But for writing, we had 16, and this was interesting. So we went back and looked at each of those cases line by line and found that actually all of them should be flagged. They all contained a significant proportion of these memorized and authentic material. And what we found was that actually the human raters just hadn't had experience with those templates. So after review, there were no false positives. The machine was correct to flag them. It was just that the human raters in that case hadn't yet become familiar with a particular template. So I think this really illustrates our philosophy for scoring going forward. It's very important that human judgment is involved in AI use and automated scoring to validate that it's making correct judgments. But the automated scoring system is much better at recognizing patterns and identifying new information. So we use them both to the best of their ability. So the limitations that we found in developing this really had to do with human judgment, in that there's kind of a gray area where humans will disagree with each other, and that's natural. But within that gray area where humans disagree, we know that we don't want the automated scoring system making decisions within the gray area. We want humans to have a say in reasoning through that decision. So that's where we had moved into this phase 2 idea, where there's a gray area. The best approach is to gather lots of pieces of information and then allow a human to make a judgment. So in this way, we're using sort of an AI-powered human judgment, sort of improving the quality of human judgments by making them more informed and armed with more information than is available when you're using a human-only scoring system. So in that phase 2, what we did was introduce a human review for describe image and retell a lecture. And what this means is that human raters score content alongside the automated scoring system for those two items. And when they score it, they see information from the automated system, and they can decide to flag something for using inauthentic text if needed. So this is illustrated here. If the human and automated scoring system agree, then the score stands. And if they disagree, then an additional human is brought in to check, and that adjudicator score stands. So this is what that process looks like. Describe image and retell lecture. Everything's still machine scored. Pronunciation and fluency are still machine scored. This is important because they're very accurate and reliable at scoring those things, and especially in terms of avoiding any bias of human scoring in that particular trait. And content uses a human check where it's most valuable. So uses humans to score content alongside the machine, and then bring in additional human judgment if needed. And that gives us our final score. One thing that's also a huge benefit of this kind of system is that this human check, because it's happening on all of the responses for these two item types, all of that data is being fed back into the automated scoring system, which means that over time it learns more from the human check and can become more accurate and sensitive in making predictions in that gray area. And this continues to evolve. So even though the system was initially developed a few years ago, we continuously update it. So one of the things we do is monitor online spaces. We use web crawlers, we're on social media. So we want to know when new templates are emerging. But we also do our own template discovery periodically. So even if a template isn't emerging on a website that's publicly available, we will notice when a large number of test takers start using that template. We compare responses, every response to every other response, to sort of identify those similar patterns of text. And this is important. All of these things are then still validated by human raters to agree that they should be included in the model. But it just means that we're able to adapt much more flexibly and notice when patterns are emerging and at the time that they begin to emerge. We use that to update the system periodically. We tend to do that at unpredictable intervals because we know that people are monitoring the test, and we don't want the updates to become predictable so that people attempt to sort of reverse engineer things. And that's useful for us. We've done a few minor updates since the system has been released, so they happen periodically. Major updates, we've done one of those, more than one actually, but major updates are defined as things where we're improving the kind of detection in the algorithm. So it's just the actual prediction is becoming more accurate. And both of those things are ongoing all the time. So I personally think this system has many benefits over relying on just humans in scoring. We can leverage a huge amount of data into a central location and detect patterns that just individual human raters can't see. And then we can apply that standard in the same way to every single test taker. So you're not worried about the particular experience that one human rater has in making a decision. We're looking at sort of the collective wisdom of all human raters and applying that standard to all test takers. That also makes it fairer, means everybody's being judged in the exact same way. And we can monitor how that's working out and performing on the test globally. So this is a much more responsible approach to scoring than human-only scoring. And it's also a responsible AI approach. We want the AI that we do use in assessment to be very evidence-based, thoroughly validated, and integrated with human judgment to make sure it's making sound decisions. So we're running towards the end of the session, and I will just leave you with these three things. The PTE scoring systems are thoroughly researched and backed by quite a lot of development activities, and it's something that's ongoing and evolving. So we will never stand still. We'll always be improving the scoring systems in one way or another. A really important part of that and a focus for us recently is on the idea of authentic communication and doing research to investigate it and demonstrate that it's something that we value and we're measuring. And a big part of that is trying to find that balance between the strength of technology and human judgment and combining them both, because I think through that you end up with the most fairness, consistency, reliability that we can in assessment right now. So that's it for me. I think we've got a minute for a question.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Sarah, for your wonderful performance on this beautiful ecosystem between human and computers, and it's like constantly evolving. And for those of you who are with us, please remember that tomorrow we will receive an email from Zoom, and in this email you will find a link to the survey. And once you complete the survey, by the end, there will be a thank you message. And in this thank you message, you will find a link to download your certificate. And there will be another link. I hope that you remember, and you already have it, a link to this Teach PTE webinars. So why I'm referring to this, because Sarah, you mentioned this Jared's webinar on how to teach describe image and retail lecture. And one of the questions was about describe image and retail lecture, how to improve without relying on template. So I strongly suggest you going there and you find previous webinars. So the previous webinar last year was Around the World with PT Academic. That was the name of the whole series. And if my memory serves you right, is 14th of November. You'll find the theme of a webinar, Describe Image and Retail Lecture by Jared. So the recording is there. So feel free to watch it. The second question, Sarah, you mentioned this research, several papers, can people around the world get access to them? So what do they need to type in the Google search so that maybe there will be a person who would like to learn more about test takers' behavior and how is it so that it is the way it is?
Sure. The best way to access our research is to just type in search PTE research. It will take you to the research webpage. There's a section with published research. It's all publicly available. It's organized into different categories. So you can quickly find all of the research we have on topics like scoring, test preparation, standards, that kind of thing.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep.
If you could share the next slide, because this is the information for our audience as well. If you just scan the QR code, it will take you to this page. So the next session, we'll have like Ask Me Anything session. So the next session will be like a one big Q&A. And in the registration link, you will find a survey link. So you could ask your questions there. So if you're planning to attend, please do share your questions, and we'll spend like the whole of the session on answering the questions about PTE. We'll have a panel of experts, so we'll touch upon several of those questions that you have or you could potentially have about PTE Academic and PTE Core. So this session is happening next week. So I guess that would be all when it comes to today's meeting. Thank you, Sarah, for being with us, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. And to our wonderful audience, thank you for being with us. We hope that the knowledge presenter will serve you as an inspiration in getting the exam preparation courses better and more effective. As we probably know, authenticity is what counts, if I could say in this way. Am I right, Sarah?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot,
Thanks
and
all.
enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.